Welcome to Varn Vlog. And today I'm doing something I don't normally do, which is a live stream. I do them for patrons often, but I don't do them for the public because I don't often like the public. However, my antisocial proclivities should not be why we're here today. I've been thinking a whole lot about Tailism, parasocial addictions, confusing those loyalties to concepts of people versus loyalties to concepts of principles, orientations, etc. And I've been stuck lately between what people don't say when they're criticizing their enemies and what they want to avoid. On one hand, we have a left that seems to increasingly make bizarre justifications for the current political ineptitude of the current administration and for the Democrats. On the other hand, we have a left that seems to think the response to quote leftist, whatever that means, tailing the quote right, whatever that means, these are all relative terms, is to double down on weird and more bizarre and incoherent talking points to seem like they're speaking truth to power, while many of people are just ignoring that these weirder and weirder ideologies are becoming so strange to justify all kinds of contortions to maintain a relationship to someone in the status quo. So the question is, why do it? Why do it? Why do I see this all the time? I had a friend of mine yesterday ask me a pretty profound question. Why is it that Marxists don't follow the money, and why do they care so much about what happens in Florida? The money isn't in Florida. And I said, look, yes, the richest states in the country tend to be liberal ones, but there's all kinds of movements right now. The number one state where the uber rich move, the fastest growing one for the uber rich, survey says is Florida. According to Fortune magazine, Florida attracts more ultra wealthy movers than any other state due to its tax policies. And then what are the wealthiest states? Are they blue or red? Who should we be mad at? Well, I'm going to share my screen, motherfuckers. According to the U.S. News and World Report, the 10 richest states are as following: Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New Hampshire. Notice you have to get California for number 5. Hawaii, not one that I hear generally discussed. Washington, Connecticut, Colorado, and Virginia. Interesting. But those are wealthiest in aggregate. They are almost all blue states with the exception of kind of Virginia and kind of Colorado. These 3 states, relatively low populations, also include New Hampshire in that, and Hawaii. But they also don't cleanly fix to the whole image of the coastal versus the red either. And then we see massive movements of wealth to places like Florida, like I said. So If you're talking about Ron DeSantis, are you really ignoring elites? See, I've been kind of disgusted with the state of exception people think they can give to those who they think speak truth to power, except they're not speaking truth at all. We ask ourselves why this is the case. Twitter files. Not Taibbi. A lot of people doubling down on this right now are really talking about it in different ways. I watched the quote MSNBC interview, and Taibbi did poorly. If I believed in Taibbi's principles, would I be defending the man or the principles? Would I be mad that he did so poorly in an interview? An interview that he called for? Was every question fair? No, but there are some pretty big factual errors that look pretty damning. You can rest your entire case on whether or not somebody doing sloppy journalism is speaking the truth. Why double down on the person and not the principle? Unless what motivates it is audience growth. The principle of free speech in a capitalist society, according to Marx, was worth fighting for, but noting that there could not be free speech without the access to spread that speech, it would not be particularly meaningful. So we point out that bourgeois rights are necessarily unfulfilled under bourgeois premises. Doesn't mean we abandon the rights entirely, even though we know that they aren't innate or inevitable or inalienable. Those concepts are just fundamentally contradictory here. You no more have natural rights than you have natural integers. Sure, it might be a useful concept for talking about things that seem to emerge and allow most people to flourish, but it's not particularly meaningful in lack of any theology which undergirds it, and most of us have quit believing in that theology a long time ago. Are people really going after Trump because he took a valiant stance against empire? Can anyone seriously believe this? The man maintained the same level of drone strikes as Obama. The remarkable thing about both sides pretending that the other side's politics is somehow going to breach the status quo and fight the system is that one, in almost all cases, these people are part of the system, regardless of how you define it. And two, in no way has there been a significant deviation in either direction except in terms of the courts. And the Democrats have made it very clear that they don't want to do much about the courts, just like the Republicans have made it very clear that they're all of a sudden finding of conscience around the military-industrial complex is about an inch deep. When I pointed this out in regards to a friend and colleague of mine seeming to really want to die on a hill about Matt Taibbi, that the principle should have been more important than a particular offense, and that the optics were bad. Yeah, Stefan says, struggle in the U.S. elite about foreign policy. It's just going to be about war with Russia versus war with Russia will distract us from war with China. Yep. Oh, sure. Trump is a wild card. Trump made the brutality of the game too obvious. But in terms of policy, which liberals supposedly cared about, there's been remarkable consistency on tariffs, on immigration. What else has been remarkably consistent? On law enforcement. Just like with the war movement, it seems to be true that the broader liberal left loses steam as soon as its candidate is in office. It quits caring. Doesn't mean individual leftists aren't writing about it, doesn't even mean that individual liberals still don't care, but in aggregate, it goes away. I've lived through 3 cycles of this. Most of you live your life vicariously through media. Let me tell you some implications of Bidenism that I see and some implications of the kinds of cynicism I see. See, you're always selectively cynicism in a way that seems to defend the status quo, which is interesting. Did we expect Biden to do any less? No. But I heard a lot of leftists say that he would. The number of people who said most progressive president since FDR, even when they were saying it to condemn other Democratic presidents, is astonishing. The number of people, both left and right, who pretended that Trumpism was a substantive policy shift on anything other than tariff law shocked me. I couldn't believe that you guys were that dumb when it happened. I had people just come up and tell me that we were in an imminent fascist threat. And I'm like, we've been in an imminent fascist threat. There's nothing particularly new about this. I'm not even sure what you mean by fascism. These forces have existed for a long time, but you're ignoring the forces with money. You're ignoring an independent voice for some kind of socialist agenda. To quote a meme, you're not making the Democrats better, you're making socialism worse. The problem is it was used to justify a popular front. People don't call it that anymore, but it was. And the problem with most of the response to the popular front is who do these people go to differentiate themselves from the social democrats, many of whom were former Trotskyists? The undercurrent of a lot of the rebellion against sort of reformist Trotskyism or post-Trotskyism, let's be honest, is that it undergirded the development of things like the DSA. Its DNA is there. Trump did accelerate the the decline of many federal agencies, but they have been declining since the 70s. Almost since the administrative state was born, have there been people chipping away at these things. I was talking about this when I was a conservative in the aughts, over 20 years ago, about how the FDA and the EPA were utilized in ways that didn't make sense. And that was back when I believed in the US system. The restoration of the Democrats, though, has not really reversed most of this. It's just made a few people more secure in their jobs. And when I read like the Robert Brenner, Dylan Riley speech, I don't know if they want us to completely split with the Democrats or continue keeping Biden's ass, because we have some weird, obviously wrong notion about what class voting and class politics is on the DSA inspired left. But most people's response to that, well, not most people, but a significant number of people's response to that is to think that, oh, we can tail the right. Not that we can reach out and meet the needs of the poor people the right speak to. No, we just can pick up their talking points, because talking points are the only thing most of you fucking know. It's all chatter all the time. The real work of politics is work. It's not media. I don't claim to do politics here, because here is not where you do politics. At most, I can do political advocacy and political education. But people still have to do things. It really doesn't matter how we feel about the Twitter files. Is there free speech collusion or not? And honestly, after seeing the reporting around Taibbi's reporting, I no longer know. But regardless, it wouldn't stop the censorship regime even if the government was out of it. We have allowed the public space to be completely privatized and carteled. Even this very program is dependent on that. There's no principle behind any of it. And if you get caught up in the machinations of this or that particular media debate and culture war on Twitter, you will never, ever, ever be able to make an independent political movement. I want to ask you something. I want to ask you something realistic about the Democrats right now and about the progressive Democrats who support them. I'm going to release a video about this, but I want people to think about it, and I want people to think about it hard. There's a cycle with municipal Democrats who run as social democrats, who run as part of left movement. We saw this with the Rainbow Coalition. We've seen it with the DSA. We saw it with the McGovern Democrats in the Harrington run, going all the way back to the 60s. There's a long history here. When they start, they try the executive candidate first, right? We go for the presidential one. If that fails, they start doing what they should have done to build up the base for the executive candidate and running municipal stuff. But usually by the time they've done that, the initial wind of opportunity with workers' militancy during a time of economic upswing, because that's when workers' militancy actually tends to happen, is an economic upswing. And then when things go down, you still see militancy. But as they continue to go down, the militancy goes away. Why? Because it's harder and harder to make actual wins. If you believe that, say, the progressive mayor of Chicago that we just got out of the, the Lori Lightfoot nothing burger, is going to have an easy time enacting a progressive agenda when they don't have currency sovereignty and can't. It's a municipality. They're at the subject of state budgets that they don't control and don't have strong coalitions in. And we're about to go in an economic downturn that it's going to be a whole lot better than the kind of island that Mayor Lumumba's been fighting in Jackson, Mississippi. You're a fool. It's not that we are dumb if you support them in Chicago, that you're dumb to support them. But if you think the work is just that, you haven't reversed anything. You've just changed the level of your error. With Biden, what has been his number one instinct? Right? One of the things that I'm going to point out in a series of stuff I did on the Brenner Riley essays, that Brenner and Riley, their 7 theses in the New Left Review. If you haven't read it, but it makes me mad. That they actually admit that Trump was actually the person under pressure of circumstances beyond Republican control who started the process which Biden continued, but Biden's the person unmantling it because it was only a temporary emergency. You were allowed to have a quasi-anemic European-style welfare state for 3 years, and it probably stalled out a recession. But it wasn't from either policy, from either president who did it. It was larger circumstances, and there were tons of mistakes. PPP loans were a disaster. And you could tell how not seriously Biden took certain relief forms, like the somewhat anemic student loan relief that he's going to give, compared to how fast they enacted to keep SBB banks people from having to face consequences for not knowing what the FDIC uninsured levels were. He did that in a night. They stalled for years with student loan forgiveness, and when they rolled it out, they made it the most onerous way possible, with so much overhead to prove justification that it probably cost more than they would have paid anyway if they even got to do it. Also setting up easy lawsuits in a court they knew they didn't control and hadn't done anything about. And what has been Biden's response to most things? Federalization. From actually enforcing their initial interpretation of Title IX on states that disagree with them because they don't want a constitutional showdown in the courts, which they would lose, most likely, because the courts aren't even holding to conservative jurisprudence in any consistent way anymore. It really is just about what each power's policy indicates once. Yeah, actually, the Biden administration's stance is they sure that their move was legal, but they weren't sure that the Supreme Court would uphold it, which is a step. And I'm taking this from the 5-4 podcast, but it's something I noticed myself. Yet they won't challenge the courts, even though they're sure that they were in the legal right, which means that they know they don't have the power to challenge the courts, or they don't want to. This appellate nonsense over abortion drugs, I guarantee you, if it goes to the Supreme Court, and I have no idea what the appellate courts are going to do to try to reconcile the two different district courts' rulings over a federal issue, that not only is it basically making lawsuits able to make FDA decisions almost irrelevant. I mean, it has implications for far more than abortion. But it's also not a case where you can see Biden winning. But he's federalized that. And there's structural incentives on elections to federalize that was shown in the midterms. We're also seeing how blatant the Republicans are. I've seen them whining about what happened in Tennessee and kicking those 2 out of 3 of those Democratic lawmakers out, even though they didn't do anything about an accused child molester for years in that Congress. But is it gonna matter? I mean, much of the whole thing was political theater. They voted out the 2 black Democrats, let the last one stand for what? For an insurrection? These are the same people who are defending January 6th. Now, I think the liberal hump about January 6th being the most dangerous thing in our history, it's kind of ridiculous, personally. I'm not saying it wasn't dangerous for democracy. I'm not saying there wasn't even really a possibility of an attempted coup. But it isn't the most dangerous thing that's ever happened to our democracy. And while people died, most of them were the people in the insurrection. And how they died, with the exception of one woman who was shot, was like complications of overexertion, or in the case of the cops, depression afterwards. I have been amazed at how people cannot stand apart from Tailism bait. You think you can manipulate the electoral calculus of a relatively consistent foreign policy apparatus, which has been designed to not have democratic inputs? You think we can do anything about these courts if the Democrats won't do it themselves because they are not enacting popular sovereignty? You think that we can go and run to Trump to heighten the contradictions when he set up the legal regime that led us here? You think any of them are meaningfully anti-imperial? Come on. And we must ask ourselves, why are left-wing figures who for years could stand independent tripping over themselves to cut one way or another? And why are the people who say we have to stand above the culture war the people who cannot help but get totally enmeshed in it? The ideologies and the excuses get stranger and stranger and stranger. Almost no one sounds coherent over time. And the people who do sound coherent seem the furthest away from politics, properly speaking, from actually doing anything. I've been accused multiple times, mostly by liberals, but lately even by anti-liberal leftists, of making the good the enemy of the perfect, or making the perfect the enemy of the good. Just nonsense. That phrase is always nonsense. What you're hiding with that phrase is we disagree on values, and you're not owning up to the disagreement. I am not a person who demands the immediate perfection of my politics. I do not think we were going to have a classless society overnight. I also don't think there are good and bad political actors, although there are more responsible and less responsible ones. We are entering a time period of multipolarity. Anyone who's been following this has known this since 2005, 2006. The moment the American century tried to make its bid politically and fell apart, this was inevitable. But many people want you to think this is somehow a good thing or a bad thing. It's a thing. It will be as useful as we make it out to be. Nothing is inevitable from it other than relative chaos. Every society on earth has problems coming up for it. China is doing much better economically than the United States, but the United States has a lot more resources. If China is forced to abandon the dollar too quickly, it would have to play the same kind of role the United States does as a consumer, because it would need to take those dollars back to make it worth it as a as the primary foreign reserve currency. Because if you're not taking the dollars back, why do people want them? So it's in a paradox. It wants to weaken the dollar and U.S. hegemony, but also doesn't want to weaken it too fast, because if it does, its long-term plans are scuttled, and the entire Russia-Ukraine situation has made it worse. And we can tell that the West is not serious about a peaceful resolution of this, because anytime anyone proposes one, they freak out about territorial grabs, as if they don't know there will have to be territorial compromises from both sides to end the war, unless there's a total victory one way or another. And modern weapons make a total victory one way or another almost unthinkable without it breaking out into a world war. Don't let anyone fool you about that, regardless of what side they're on. I'm sure people think I'm attacking my comrades, and maybe I am. I don't think I'm attacking them. I think I'm criticizing them for a tactical error and for confusing defending a man versus defending their principle. Zane, everyone has valid concerns. Everyone had valid concerns at each step of the way, that it was unequal power. It doesn't change the fact of how this thing began. There's stuff to do, there's stuff to organize. But I'll be honest with you, I've been a union rep now for 2 years, and I've been demoralized. Regardless of all this online and media advocacy stuff, my actual advocacy work is demoralizing. What I actually do is politics. I don't talk about it on here, okay? One, I don't want to attract the kind of attention to my day job that this brings if I was to talk more explicitly about it. And two, like, I'm having to deal with a union that is in a very conservative state and has partially a very conservative constituency, has no legal recompense to change its charter, and is under the auspices of the state, which says we can no longer strike, etc. Which, by the way, covers more of the labor movement in the United States than it doesn't, as I've made many, many times. And what I've seen by people who try to truly stand apart from this, over time they get incoherent. See, this is a question that I've been asking myself. Why is it that a lot of my idols that I respected 10, 20 years ago, and I'm not going to name names because many of them are still alive and some of them are reactive in the media sphere, why have they been so incoherent lately? Why is everyone also going towards simple and fossil really um, narratives about World War II? It's not the same war. I actually, just to validate you a little bit, Zane, do think that NATO expansion has been kicking a down bear in the face, and then surprised when it's getting bit. But that doesn't mean that there are good and bad sides solely in this. You should understand how it happened and why it's rational for all sides to act the way they do. If you're going to be an anti-militarist, which I think is more important than being anti-war or picking sides in this war or pretending that revolutionary defeatism, a la Zimmerwald Wef, even vaguely applies here, then you're going to have to really understand what logic leads people to these conclusions. Because I can tell you, when I look at all sides of this, I actually really do see how this continues to move in the way it does. What worries me is the people who remembered how much of an existential threat this all was have largely been marginalized, even from the ghouls in the establishment. You cannot understand this simply in those militarist terms. If you're a Marxist, you have to look at the economics of it all, and it's not good on either side. The ability to stand apart in any situation of importance and not try to be a rank opportunist is absolutely paramount if you're going to posit a truly different society. Does not mean you're not going to have to make compromises. You are. I draw my line at defending NATO personally, but I do want to understand why countries like Finland and Sweden are acting the way they're acting and not just assume it's a conspiracy that I have no evidence for. In many ways, we can call this what it is. It's coping. That's why I'm somewhat forgiving of people making tactical mistakes or confusing parasocial relationships with principles, because they're seeing any principles seem to fall apart. And they're coming up with more and more incoherent justifications and ideologies to justify that. I don't say people should join or not join the DSA. I think that's neither here nor there in a lot of ways. If you join the DSA and your goal is to change its orientation towards the Democratic Party, well, good luck to you. I think the odds are against you, but it is a valid thing to do. It's no different than me joining a union with the same kind of orientation, except that I do get more immediate payoffs for doing that. And it is actually a workers' organization. But the class theories that go around, the orientation theories, the strategy theories, they get harder and harder to justify, don't they? Uh, My right wing friend who told me to follow the money, going, "Oh, well, he's not right wing anymore. He used to be right wing friend, but so did I." That's not a disparagement on his character. Should be very careful about that. Who called me to say, "Look at the money. It's not the Florida people whose kids are getting into Ivy League schools." And now I'm looking at it and going, "Well, but it is the Florida donor class." But the one thing he said that was right, that I'll repeat to you, is that a highly propagandized society, when it goes to break with that propaganda, often doesn't have a way to replace it with anything meaningful. Often it just inverts the propaganda or invents counter propaganda or falls into a facile conspiracism or whatever. And this is not just a right or left phenomenon. I mean, QAnon's an example of this on the right. Um, the only way out of that is to know what you're doing and how you're doing it. When I talk about unions in the Democratic Party, one of the things about that is people who talk about that often talk about that as if that was willed. It's not willed. It's systemic. There are, and attempts to get out of it so far have failed. It's also the only avenue a lot of workers have. I mean, a lot of leftists who are constantly involved in celebrating them aren't even in the unions. They don't even know the struggle within the union itself. Some of them do. It's not to say that they don't. And if you pin them down, they'll admit the problems. But if you really pin them down, like happened with the railroad strike, a lot of them will buck and defend the Democrats anyway. Why is that? And most of the union rank and file, I can tell you, aren't that involved in most places. When people press me on why we're having such union problems in times of actual worker militancy, I don't think that worker militancy is fake. I want to tell you, it's real hard to do. We're seeing real union actions in Britain, and you know what? Nobody in the British left thinks that it's actually going to work. And the British left, after Corbynism, has been decimated. In France, we're seeing people take BlackRock, but we haven't seen Macron back down. So there's big actions. There's big actions in a lot of places. It's been amazing how hard it is to remain independent. I mean, it's even hard on me. I went on a MNT podcast and talked about the Soviet Union, and I didn't defend the purges. I didn't defend the Cotton Massacre. I did point out that some of the problems with the kulaks weren't totally fake, although it was often used to scapegoat people. But I pointed out that when Bukharin was purged, Stalin actually adopted the policies of of the left opposition in words of collectivization, not in the way they would have done it. I believe the left opposition would have done it a different way, but the problems would have still the food problems would remain the same. And I pointed out that there are some scholars who even think that that wasn't necessary to build up the industrial capacity to fight World War II. Although I also pointed out that given how flat-footed Stalin was in the invasion of Stalingrad, he clearly didn't think it was going to be as soon as that, so that can't be used as a justification for prior policies. And for the most part, people reacted okay. Some people told me that I had a racist stage theory and that I was a revisionist Stalinist. That was fun. And some of my Trotskyist friends got mad at me. But the truth was the truth. That my position that after the faction ban in 1921 and after the failure of the German Revolution and between 1917 and 1919, that there wasn't going to be a good way for this all to play out. And particularly once the Sino-Soviet split happened. And the Sino-Soviet split had its origins and things that go all the way back to 1926. All the way back to the first Soviet diplomat doing outreach to both the Soviet Communists and the Kuomintang. See, my point on this in modern politics is sometimes you have to admit you can't immediately fix a past mistake. You can't undo a historical failure. You can't right the wrong. The Ever-Hoja split was the most interesting. It was the most interesting and also one of the most dramatically disastrous. See, one of the problems with leftists, particularly leftists who are ideologically motivated, is they think a lot of these things are justified in the ideology that people state and not on real politics. This even goes back to the revisionist controversy, not the one after Stalin died, but the original one, the Bernstein one. Because one of the things that I have learned, I did a whole interview with Jim of Pro Cult Films on this, is that whatever you think Bernstein's problems were, and we both agree, both Jim and I agreed that he came to the incorrect conclusions. That he was actually trying to address real problems in the SPD's actual strategy, whereas the Orthodox people were increasingly separating what they were advocating for and what they were doing. In that sense, many of Lenin's critiques against Kautsky are unfair, but the critique that he rendered communist orthodoxy subsumed to opportunism is correct. And ironically, it's Bernstein's actions that point that out. What does it have to do today? We're not even there. The American left is in a weird spot. It was told it had avenues to power, and it got it basically by presenting a candidate within a system to make itself politically relevant, but having no effect on the actual political outcomes of that system for very long. And what was learned, oh, well, the Democrats are going to screw you. No, every one of these people are going to screw you. They're bourgeois parties. The character of individual leaders is kind of relevant at crucial decision points, but ultimately, who keeps the whole thing running? The U.S. left is just X is almost always going to be wrong. So yeah, disagreements over the Taibbi issue are minor. But if you actually believe in the principle, and the person who I'm talking about really truly does, I know he does, I know him personally, then that mistake isn't minor, and doubling down on it's actually shooting yourself in the foot and your legitimacy in the foot. No one's ever had any fidelity to the bourgeois revolution, Jack Montaro. That's why Bonapartism emerged immediately. In every case. Fidelity to a revolution understands that totally as a voluntaristic act, as an ideal act. And the orientation is important. The principles matter. Don't get me wrong. But where people give up on principles and why and what their material limits are, that's going to be the real issue. The problem with the proletarian cause is that so far we've been waiting for 250 years for it to actually happen. In all cases that I can think of, which is not to say that that cause won't happen. If I didn't think it was possible, I would probably no longer be a Marxist. But I do think we have to ask ourselves in some serious event, in some serious way, why it hasn't been delivered on in a sustainable way. Because in all successful, actually existing socialists, you have a collaborationist project. Paris Commune failed, my friend. Its failure is what launched the whole thing. It's important to understand that. It's actually interesting, though. It is interesting that our case for a most clear and successful application of the methodology of proletarian action is one that happens in the very beginning of capitalism being a world system, not just, inchoate various national ones. And it's something for us to think about. Oh, Zane, you were a Khmer Rouge apologist? And it wasn't just that they picked a fight with Vietnam or the Mekong Delta. And that wasn't a proletarian revolution. It was a nationalist one. One which, by the way, the U.S. supported. Ah, yes. I now know who you are. You're a Platt. Bonapartism provides an opportunity for socialist politics. Yeah. I've seen this slowly emerging. You know what's funny though, Jack? I'm just gonna say this. I actually agree with most of what you're saying. I'm pretty sure I know what your politics are. Maybe I'm wrong. The national question has diluted, so absolutely has diluted socialist politics. It's also the one where we have the most diffuse answer. Like that there's not a whole lot of guidelines in the primary text to help us. There's not a whole lot of historical guidelines to help us. It's okay. Plats are welcome here. I don't kick people out because they're political police, particularly when I agree with most of what you're saying. But here's what I will say. If we are actually advocating for socialist independence, it needs to be on our terms. It needs to be from our politics. It needs to have our base behind it. Here's another thing where I'm gonna say I think a lot of people's brains got broke. It's taken a long time for people to realize what anti-Trumpism was used for. So you guys see what's in the back on that side. Unfortunately, I'll have to turn the camera. You don't see what's in the back on this side. There are D&D books on that side. But down here, there's a whole shelf of Bukharin and Trotsky and Mao. And I think Bukharin is what we're going to have to look at. Does it solve all the problems? Absolutely not. Bukharin has his own contradiction. We all have our own contradictions. I know one of the flat figureheads who likes me personally also said that I'm highly symptomatic, which is fair. He's probably right. I was in so is Platypus, so are we all. Bukharin is relevant because Bukharin actually realized that you can't forsake the goals of socialism in the long run, which is a class of society and a dictatorship of the proletariat, by totally being principled in the short run, which is, including the peasantry and proletarianization. Yeah, with Spencer. Sounds like something Spencer would say. I like any perceived war I have with the platypus affiliated society is over, even when I disagree with them. And by the way, I've been complaining about. We can call a spade a spade. I've been complaining about Doug Lane today a little bit, but I don't think Dunn's done anything unforgivable or wrong or unprincipled. I think he's just got the wrong principle here. It's got to be bigger than that, or he needs to have a larger vision. Socialist independence and workers' autonomy is something that I care a lot about. Design manager. There isn't a way in which we're going to be able to navigate this by trying to replay history, but also by trying to pretend that it didn't lead us to where we are. That's the important thing for me, is do we understand how we got here? Because maybe in understanding that, we can understand how to get out of it. But we won't be able to repeat anything in the past exactly as it happened in the past. Nobody is without contradictions, even the best of us. And nobody, and I really do mean this, nobody who comes in good faith should be treated as beyond reproach. But it doesn't mean that we have to put up with their bullshit either. Anyway, so what I have to say, I'm not going to spend all time in a live session. I've gone for an hour. Like and subscribe. You can share if you want to. I hope you all continue the debate. You don't have to agree with me. But if you're going to continue the debate, also do the work that undergirds that debate. That's all I ask of you. Have a good day.